would you characterize the main organizing principle or the framework or the paradigm of your research?
So, it's a difficult question, of course. I would say what we would really like to do is, as I indicated, find a sort of biological background for themes that are unifying universal themes in humans today. And that makes us unique compared to all organisms that exist today and our closest extinct relatives then. That will be sort of a biological substrate of, say, what makes human culture possible. Not what explains human culture, but something of a scaffold that made that building of human culture possible, say.
You are the director of evolutionary anthropology at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. In the course of your term there, you have brought together DNA experts, linguists, primatologists, psychologists, essentially an interdisciplinary collaboration. In this context, what are your views on the future of scientific research, A, and B, secondly, on our current system of education and the future of conventional, traditional academic disciplines like anthropology, sociology, psychology?
Well, so I think probably...
Is that a fair question?
Yeah, well, if it's a fair answer, I don't know.
Yeah, because,
but, I mean, it depends on the area of science and research, probably. But if you're interested in questions about human uniqueness, what sets humans apart, that's per definition an interdisciplinary question. So it's very valuable to bring together different disciplines that are traditionally at the universities and very much kept apart. You talk about humanities, natural sciences, and so on. And the principle we found to bring them together was actually to focus on that everyone, the litmus test, so to be able to work, has to be empirical, has to be data-based. Because there is actually no problem for me to understand what a linguist does, as long as her or his work is data-based. So you can discuss what your ideas, what data should you collect, how do you test it. And that's actually how everybody in this institute works. And on that level, it's really possible to work in an interdisciplinary way and contribute to each other's work, I think.
I see. Now, going into a little bit more of your research itself, studies are showing that the phenotypical differences between humans and chimpanzees are due not so much to mutation and selection, but due to differential gene expression. What are the factors? First of all, what do you mean by gene expression? A. B. What are the factors that affect gene expression? For instance, I've been reading about the fact that there have been studies of diets on mice that have changed gene expression.
Yes, so this goes back actually to work by Mary Claire King and Alan Wilson at Berkeley, who first pointed out 20 years ago or so that gene expression is probably a very major cause to the differences between humans and the great apes. But it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that one have gotten the technical possibilities to look into that. And indeed, for example, if you look on what genes are turned on and off and to what level are they turned on and make proteins in different tissues between humans and chimps, it's actually a lot of genes, say 10% of genes or so, that differ significantly. Now, that is not to be seen as like some total dichotomy with nucleotide sequence changes, because those expression changes actually rely to a large extent on nucleotide changes in regulatory sequences in the genome, for example. But it's of course also true that much of such differences in how genes are turned on and off are due to influences from the environment. So we did an experiment that you probably refer to there, where we fed laboratory mice 4 different diets. Actually, the normal kibble they get in the mouse house, or the food our employees get in their cafeteria, or the food that our chimpanzees get in the ape facility in the zoo in Leipzig. And the fourth one was a bit more sensitive. It was an exclusive McDonald's diet. And
Did everybody get that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So the interesting result of that was actually that the McDonald's mice, of course, became more like tennis balls forms after a few weeks. They were very happy, though. When we then compared gene expression in the liver of these mice, although the McDonald's mice were very fat and the ones on our cafeteria diet were much leaner, the two ones on a human diet differed significantly in their liver and what genes that had turned on from the one on the chimp diet and the mouse diet. So there's really something in this human diet that is quite different from the one, and we don't really know what that is. It might have to do with cooking, for example. And the interesting thing was also that there was an overlap of those genes that changed in those mice with the differences we see between humans and chimpanzees when we look in the liver. So much of this is also due to simply behavioral differences in what we eat, for example.
So in terms of the terminology that most of us would understand, where does that kind of research put the argument in terms of nature versus nurture as to who we turn out to be as people or mice or whatever?
Well, I think, as always, it's really a combination. There is, of course, a clear biological foundation for being a human. What one doesn't do today, but that was done earlier, was try to rear newborn chimpanzee children in a human family. Of course, they will learn many things. They will learn, say, 100, 200 words. But they will not become fully adequate in human language or in human behavior. So there is clearly a sort of biological substrate that we are very interested in finding out for being a human. But much of what we fill that substrate with is, of course, culture.
I see. So again, to take an example, in terms of, say, for instance, a pregnant woman and prenatal conditions. Differing prenatal conditions might affect different gene expressions?
I'm no expert in that, but I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will.
You're convinced it will. Yeah, I see. Now on to Neanderthals for a minute. Your research specified that Neanderthals seem to have gone extinct between 24 to 30,000 years ago. Evidence in a cave in Gibraltar seems to suggest that they were far more capable than what was understood earlier. Fire, tools, etc. have been found. So what accounts for their extinction? The multiple reasons have been given, but
that's
what
a
is your theory?
million-dollar question, and no one knows the answer, of course. I sometimes try to avoid the question by saying that it says more about us and our worldview, how we speculate about why Neanderthals are not there, than about what really happened. So you can go either way. You could say, clearly it was the first genocide. Look how we behave today to each other. We must have killed them all. And it can sound plausible. I can say that, look in the Middle East, the earliest fully modern humans appear there 93,000 years ago. The last Neanderthals are there around 60,000 years ago. So we have 30,000 years of peaceful coexistence, and that in the Middle East.
Right.
Also sounds plausible.
Right.
So which of these versions are true, we really don't know. I think there is clearly an argument for that when modern humans come to an area and establish themselves, after a while at least, Neanderthals do disappear. So I do think it has something to do with humans and probably competition. But what form that competition was, we probably will never really know.
I see. Now, you're referring to competition. I have read also about possible other reasons, such as climate change, of course, inbreeding, and cannibalism among the Neanderthals as possible explanations of their extinctions. Is there any plausibility to those explanations, or is it?
I would regard them all as Implausible.
Implausible.
Implausible,
Okay.
yes.
Um,
I mean, the Neanderthals had survived several periods of very harsh
I
conditions
see.
before they, after all, existed as a group in the order of 400,000 years. I think maybe we should come together in, say, 300,000 years and see if we are as successful as the Neanderthals were.
Do we see them amongst us today?
Mm.
Meaning, did they interbreed?
That is something that we are analyzing just in these weeks as we now speak. So we have the Neanderthal, first version of the Neanderthal genome. What is already known is that there is not any large contribution specifically to Europe where Neanderthal used. One would have seen that in the variation in humans that exist today. But we can now ask much more detailed questions about this interaction, possible interaction. For example, mixing can go two ways, of course. Can for the first time look in the Neanderthals if there was contribution from early human ancestors into Neanderthals. Or even very early on, for example, if, say, 100,000, 200,000 years ago, there were connections between early human ancestors and Neanderthal ancestors.
The central role that biology has taken in the last 40 to 50 years, ever since the DNA molecule was first configured by Watson and Crick. When it comes to understanding ourselves, where do you think this will lead? Do you foresee a day when the human, or for that matter, all life will be an open book? If at all, when?
I do not think that life will be an open book due to genomics or genetics.
I see.
It's almost fascinating to me that I'm old enough in this business now. Let's say 20 years ago I had a talk to journalists about saying, wait a minute, it's not only environment and education, it's also genes that matters. And now I'm in the opposite role, of telling them, wait a minute, it's not only genes, it's all these other things also that matters.
It turns out that just accidentally, day before yesterday evening, I got home, and as I mentioned to you over the telephone, I happened to be flipping channels, and PBS had a show on the hand-walking humans, a family in Turkey where 5 of 17 children never got past the stage of crawling and are still now between the ages of 18 and 34, still crawling on their force. Then there was another, in the same show, there was another group of youngsters in the UK where the children had difficulties with their speaking abilities. And the third example was given about what they describe as a microencephaly, where the brain, the brain size is as small as it was in earlier primates. Now, I know your research has to do with FOXP2. So perhaps if you would tell us a little bit more about the FOXP2 and what might that entail as it relates to those 5 children that have speaking disabilities. There was, for instance, one of the speculations in the show was a Turkish geneticist or evolutionary biologist suggesting that it indicated devolution, meaning a step backwards as far as evolution was concerned, though largely discounted. So is this another example of gene expression where it is truncated at a stage that failed to evolve into the stages where one is able to talk or one is able to walk? Or
I think it's more the situation that these diseases that you find by genetic means will point you to genes that are important, for example, in speech production with FOXP2. So if the FOXP2 gene, if you have one copy destroyed by a mutation, you will have a severe speech and language problem. So that led Tony Monaco's group to identify this gene. So now you have a gene that you know is important in this process. But this mutation that destroys the gene is, of course, not a step back in evolution to some earlier stage. but it allows you to study a gene now that's important in this and study its evolution. So when we then sequenced it in humans and the apes, we find 2 substitutions in this very conserved gene that was unique to humans. And when we now...
2 substitutions compared to a FOXP2 in what?
In the apes.
In the apes.
So in chimpanzees and gorillas and all the other primates. So when we then engineer those 2 substitutions into a mouse FOXP2 gene, we can actually confirm that this seems to have something to do with vocalization, because the mice do peep differently when you do that.
Huh.
But that's not the same mutations as in the family, because those mutations simply knock out the gene. These are 2 mutations that change from one functional state to another functional state in the gene. And I think for understanding sort of the evolution of some human-specific traits, that is perhaps a way to go in the future, to actually construct animal models like that for some tiny aspects of them that you can then study, like with these mice.
So do you suppose, going back to the Neanderthals for a second, just as they are trying to do with the woolly mammoth, do you suppose we would be able to reconstruct a Neanderthal with the correct substitutions of the FOXP2 so they would be amongst us talking?
No, well, first of all, the Neanderthals had the same version of FOXP2 as
they
us.
do, okay.
We do.
I have to apologize to the Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Yes.
But on the more general question, of course not. I know there are people that go around and say we will clone Neanderthals to find out what they are like.
No.
I think it's sort of both technically and ethically totally indefensible to sort of contemplate that, of course. We would not create a human being purely for scientific curiosity, of course.
The Nobel laureate Paul Dirac made a statement which is quite remarkable, basically saying the solution of great problems requires the giving up of great prejudices. What might be some of the prejudices in your field that you currently see that you have to, not just you, but in your discipline, have to give up?
That is, of course, a hard question, because I probably don't know what are really prejudices that I share wholeheartedly.
But as you see them in others, of course.
Well, that gets also sensitive in another way. That's a difficult one, I think.
We can pass on it for now.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Maybe come back to it when we hear the questions from the audiences.
Okay.
I can use that as illustration.
All right. So my last question,
Yes.
I promise, and then we'll turn it over to the audience here. You have been chasing a question for 25 years now. What makes humans human? Have you found the answer?
No, we have not. But we hope we are a bit closer, and that we will be a lot closer, and with the Neanderthal genome provide a tool also for the biological community at large to ask questions. It's not so that we will stare at the Neanderthal genome and have all the answers, but it's a tool for future biologists to really ask these questions in a much better way.
Well, thank you. At this point, I think we can get to the audience. Anybody who has a question? We have time for a few. So that gentleman over there in the back, and then we'll come to Dr. Charles Murray, and who else? Okay, those two on that side. Go ahead, sir.
I'm not a geneticist by training, but having listened to your talk about the homologies of chimpanzees and early man, I wonder if you were on the aesthetic committee for the Kistler organization, if you would change the relative proportions of the double helix and the world and reverse them.
So making it smaller or bigger, the DNA?
I'd make the DNA molecule much smaller and the world much bigger, based on what I learned from your talk tonight.
So the question was...
would you care to elaborate on the question if you... Okay. I think you're being somewhat cryptic, so...
That was cryptic? It's just a question of fundamentally about the enormous changes that have occurred that are largely superficial in the human genome as a consequence of the radiation environmentally across the broad planet.
Oh, I see.
So it's of course true that we don't have huge genetic changes, but important one in the origin of humans, right? And there are probably actually rather few changes. In my dream world, it's a rather few changes we will identify that have allowed humans and to develop technology and culture and change the biosphere as we have. So I do think that the genomic changes will be quite important to find. So I don't know about the proportions. Maybe we can keep them.
Dr. Murray?
The book published recently for a general audience by Henry Harpending and Gregory Cochrane, The 10,000-Year Explosion, which essentially argues that human evolution has not stopped and that indeed there have been very important evolutionary changes in the last 10,000 years since the advent of agriculture. And Cochrane and Harpending are especially well known for their argument that Ashkenazi Jews, for example, and the elevated IQ there is a product of a matter of centuries, from about 800 to 1500. I just would like to have your reaction as you read that sort of thing as to how it fits into the way you see the data.
Because I would really be extreme skeptic of that. I would say that in a growing population, it takes a long time for a new mutation to come to fixation or come to a high frequency. So we would have to think about very high selection coefficients, if you like, a very high advantage of a new variant for it to have a chance to spread. So I really, and the few examples we have with agriculture, for example, lactose tolerance, is particularly those things where we directly interact with the environment, as I point out. Something that we eat, where we sort of have a very direct influence. So I would really tend to think that those things are to a large extent cultural differences, actually.
Dr. King?
Svante, you deferred a bit the question of how you would consider the biases among people in our field, and what you would consider to be interesting biases in our field. And I wonder if the biases of our field might include the arrogance of exceptionalism, that every culture considers itself exceptional and uniquely promised in some way. And indeed, every culture may be exceptional and uniquely promised in some way, but all cultures are. That is, that the heterogeneity within the human species is so great that every culture indeed has the right to make this claim, but no culture has the right to make it uniquely, on the basis, of course, of genetic heterogeneity and genotypic analysis.
Of course, there is a bias in our culture with the technological advances we have to claim exceptionalism. That may be something one looks back to one day and points to as an enormous bias in this time. That could well be.
Very narrow view.
Yes.
Everyone has their own narrow view.
If I
Of
could
course,
have
but I mean, perhaps to sort of relate to this foundation too, I guess it's also true that precisely this economical and technological development that our culture has produced is what influences the biosphere to this extent today. So it does come perhaps with a special responsibility to think about what we do.
So earlier your comment about the experiment with rats. And we know that in terms of agricultural systems, there's a lot of emphasis over time around monocultures, particular breeds of agriculture being reinforced over and over again. So if you were to fast forward and if we continue on that trend where we're developing, singular species of potatoes that we're creating fries all around the world, or we're basically narrowing down the food in which we eat, is there a possibility that we lose some of the diversity that we've gained over the last 300,000 years? And does that put us at risk to become like the Neanderthals, sort of a whisper on the Kistler path of evolution at some point?
Yeah. Well, I do think that it puts a domesticated species at risk, because in the first part of it, because it is a great risk in that we reduce diversity enormously in these domesticated species. I don't know how convinced I am that it poses a risk to us as a species, because we still have a huge diversity of things that we consume and eat, and if we look globally, of course, worldwide. But I do think it puts our cultivars at risk.
Bill? Professor Calvin?
Svante, the current dating for Homo sapiens from the record takes it back to about 200,000 years ago, that's say in the middle of the previous ice age. It's only 3/4 of the way through that period, about 50,000 years ago, that you get sort of the effervescence of creativity. As say, lots of tool styles, lots of evidence of planning ahead, things like that. It's sometimes called the creative explosion, but whatever you want to call it, there's a question of why the emergence of this 3/4 of the way through the Homo sapiens period. Would you care to comment?
I really have no strong opinions of that. I mean, it's of course also true that the archaeological record is very patchy, so it could very well be that there was a cumulative sort of ratchet-like effect where you accumulated these things and they appear then to suddenly come later in the record. But yes, I would be.
Go ahead, Richard.
Do you have any hunches, empirical or otherwise, about some of the mutations that may in fact stick with our species in the future? What can we look forward to in the near term as possible mutations for adaptation?
In a way, my bias with that would be to say that any genetic change in humans is so slow that I would really expect any response to things to be cultural. I would really think that we have, or is at least fruitless to speculate about genetic change in the future when we don't know the cultural change. Sometimes I like when I talk to people about this to say traffic accidents is a big risk to our children, but we're not waiting for mutations that make them look out for cars. We create sort of crosswalks and talk to them about looking out for cars. It's a cultural response to this cultural technological threat, right? And I think that's really where the future is. I think we have to live pretty much with the gene pool and the genome we have and adapt culturally, I would say.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, one more? Okay. You? Okay. Since you're a trustee, I guess I have to allow that. Okay, go ahead.
Svante, will our modern species, as we're here today, and our whole civilization as we know it, global, will we go extinct?
Eventually, so the question is, will we go extinct?
But not because the sun is going to die, but in terms of other factors, evolutionary factors.
So the question is, will we go extinct? And eventually, absolutely. But why and when, I have no clue. So.